So, my name is Marcus Manuel, and I have the privilege of being a senior research associate here at the Overseas Development Institute. I've been here for the last 8 years. Previously, I was at the Treasury. Previously, I was at the Department for International Development. But I started my career dealing with the Commonwealth Debt Recording Management System for 2 years in Fiji, which we managed to use in order to work out which debts we were able to repay. Because we had some rather expensive stuff, we were able to prepay early, much to the annoyance of the lenders who thought they could just carry on taking very large sums of money from Fiji. Anyway, so that worked rather well, but things have moved on a long way from there, but it's really nice to be reflecting back on these challenges. So yesterday we talked a lot about what are the factors that could trigger another debt crisis, and I think, and how can we avoid that happening again? Clearly, governments in all this have got the primary role in making these decisions. And therefore, this session does focus very much on what country officials can be doing in borrowing countries to keep debt on a sustainable path. Obviously, domestic resource mobilization is part of the answer, but managing debt well is another key element of that process. But that is now becoming more difficult and more challenging. Because the instruments are available are more complicated, there are more options out there, and certainly what I learned 30 years ago would not have been sufficient to manage the challenges that we've now face. Also, there's an increasing gap emerging between grant and concessional financing and how countries seek to managing that. So, and at the same time, we've got the continued vulnerability to the external circumstances. I was just talking to Godfrey about the challenges in Uganda and how they have sought to manage that process. So I think the picture that came out yesterday, there are some countries that are in debt distress in sub-Saharan Africa, and the numbers are rising, which is what is of concern and is prompting this event. But also, and this is a point to pick up today, there are some countries that are managing it very well. And therefore, I'm really delighted that we've got two examples of that here today on our panel, both Uganda and Sierra Leone. And also, in part of the process, there are a range of institutions that are seeking to support countries to ensure they manage this process really well. And so, again, delighted. I'll introduce our panel in a second, but we've got people who are also involved in trying to help countries manage their debt. So we've got both sides of that process in here. So the three questions that we want to try and answer today. And first of all, what has it been? What are the factors that have enabled some countries to borrow responsibly following debt relief? So both Uganda and Sierra Leone have benefited from HIPC debt relief in the past, and they are now managing sustainably. So how have they managed to do that, and what are the lessons for other countries? Secondly, what are the challenges they now face, given the evolving financial landscape, to ensure that they do remain on a sustainable path? And thirdly, given these challenges, how can the providers of technical assistance best support national authorities to ensure that they remain on track? So I'd now at this stage like to introduce our panelists. So on this side and going across, so Godfrey Datemwa, he is the Commissioner of Debt Policy and Issuance in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in Uganda. I think it's quite striking. I worked for many years in Uganda, and there was no Commissioner of Debt Policy. I think the fact there is one is a reflection of what Uganda has chosen to do, and I'm delighted that Godfrey is in that role and taken up that role quite recently. Next to him, Charles Conti, who is the head of the Public Debt Management Division in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development in Sierra Leone, where he's played that role for many years. I think at least 15 years in various roles globally and regionally advising on debt. So two people with real intense and deep experience of their own countries. Then I'm delighted that Baba Musa has come to join us. He is currently the director of the Debt Management Department at the West Africa Institute for Finance and Economic Management, WAFEM. So for over 10 years, he's been involved in advising West African governments and supporting them around that. And for his efforts, he's actually now about to be promoted, and he is Director General Designate of the entire Institute. So congratulations on that role, which will start in January. Perhaps we can have you back again at that point and introduce you as the Director General. Then I'm delighted to introduce my colleague from the Overseas Development Institute, Shakira Mustafa, who has put together a lot of this conference, as you may be vaguely aware from behind the scenes. She's also is a research fellow here, and she focuses on public financial management reforms as well as debt sustainability and management. And typically when she wrote up herself, she admitted what I think is the other really interesting part of her CV was that she comes from Trinidad and Tobago and spent many years there actually working on public investment issues as well. So she also is not just a researcher, but has actually done it for real. And then finally, Carolina Rentiara, who is the division chief of one of the public financial management divisions of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, which many of you will know, many of you are involved in, many of you have been supported by. And so they're responsible for delivering capacity development and developing comprehensive public financial management analytical agenda. But like many of our panelists, she also has a prior role. Previously, she was the Minister of Planning and a member of the President's Cabinet in Colombia, and was also for many years the National Budget Director and the Senior Advisor to the Council of Fiscal Policy. So she knows very much at first hand what it is to face issues around financing and how do you balance aspirations against financing. So with that, you can see why we're so pleased and honoured to bring 5 practitioners to the room and to share their insights. And I'll start first of all turning to Godfrey. Please do share your experience. Now, how is it that Uganda, I came to Uganda at the time that debt relief had just been awarded, and you and I worked together about how to spend that money well. But it's good to hear about how you've managed to keep things on track since then. But thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. That's wrong. Is that?
Yep. I think it's that one. That way. And that one.
Oh, okay. Like Marcus has introduced, I'm here to share the Uganda's experience. Once again, my name is Godfrey Datemo, Commissioner Education Policy and Issuance, Debt Policy and Issuance. Uganda is just a small country by way of introduction, located in East Africa with a small GDP, less than $27 billion. The per capita is about $700, but we still have an ambitious plan to reach the middle income status. In the next 2 years, that means our GDP per capita should be slightly more than 1,000. We remain ambitious. Debt has evolved over time, particularly after there was some state of peace after Idi Amin and so on. So we started borrowing in the 1980s. And by 1991, we're getting into crises already. 1991, there was debt to GDP, if we can still go by that, exceeding 80%. And for that matter, we started getting into strategies. Debt relief, like Marcus has hinted on it, we were fully involved, and Uganda was one of actually the first country to qualify for the HIPIC. Before we got also the opportunity to benefit from the Matrato Debt Relief Initiative. The current debt situation and its management is such that total debt is about $10.65 billion. This is mainly constituted of the external, and in terms of composition, it is about 67, 33, 67 external. We are doing the public debt management from a number of policy frameworks. We have a public debt management framework which provides the objectives and also benchmarks for borrowing. We also have the debt management, the medium-term debt management strategy. Every year we carry out the debt strategy analysis. But of course we also have a law that where we fit in terms of public finance and management. That table, I don't know whether you can see from where you're seated, but we're trying to provide the debt cost and the risk indicators. And with the risk indicators, we're focusing on the refinancing, we're focusing on the interest rate, and we're focusing on the exchange rate risk. If you can't see, in terms of for refinancing, we're looking at the average time to maturity, and we are seeing that for domestic debt, this is generally increasing. Sorry, this is generally falling for the debt that matures in 1 year. And this is fitting within the policy because we want to have long-term domestic debt. Well, by default, the external one is falling because over time we are beginning to take on short-term debts because we cannot continue relying on concessional long-term lenders. Much as we wish, they may not be there, and we have a lot of programs which require short-term. For interest rates, we aim at having fixed interest rates. All the domestic debt has its interest rates fixed. External, over 96% is fixed because of recent need for more and urgent funding. We now have some variable interest rate fixed. For exchange rate risk, the aim is to go domestic, but we cannot afford, like we discussed yesterday, we still have a weak domestic market, so inevitably we remain with some more risk. However, we have
Just say you've got 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Wow. So how have we sustained our debt strategy? This is the gist of the matter. That one I've already gone through more or less. The average time to maturity, debt maturing, and so on. We shall just move. That one we've gone through. I think what we are now what we will look at now are the emerging challenges. The other 6 we have focused on them and we're managing them very well, but emerging challenges. Growing fiscal deficit due to slow growth in revenue to GDP. This has been a problem. We also have debt that is less concession that is coming up as we develop. We have poor report performance that hinders external debt service. Low absorption capacity. This is a very big problem, especially in terms of big projects. The big projects or mega projects we're referring to going slow, mainly because of compensation of the affected people, but also counterpart funding. The other minister talked about it. It's a big challenge. We also now have increased targets in terms of as we move towards the middle-income status. We have supplementary budgets, and almost for all supplementary budgets, the politicians will say borrow from the domestic market. This tends to raise the interest rates and crowd out the private sector. In terms of way forward for the growing fiscal deficit, the revenue that we are looking at trying to mobilize more revenue. Our domestic revenue to GDP is quite small compared to the region. So we're trying to have come up with a strategy which we're trying to focus on to widen the base. We're also trying to say, much as we are moving, as we develop, moving up from a concessional, the concessional borrowing, concessionality is taken into account as per the framework. For every borrowing that we do, we weigh what kind of concessionality is there. In terms of low absorption capacity, we're trying to address this by addressing matters to do with the compensations and so on.
Could I suggest we end on this slide because we're just over time now.
So,
is there anything else?
it's over?
Yep. Okay.
I stop there?
Yeah, you stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was just a brilliant whistle-top tour. Thank you. We can come back to that one later on. But thank you. Charles, I just wanted to, so we can just keep capturing the range of experience we have. Charles, over to you. Take us through about Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much. Of course, I'm Charles, and Sierra Leone is a very small country of a population of about 7 million. Its GDP is about $4 billion. By 2006, our total debt was $1.6 billion. Sierra Leone reached EP completion point in December 2006. So by end of 2007, our debt reduced dramatically from $1.6 billion to $530 million. And in fact, collapsing from 122% of GDP to 26% of GDP within 1 year. So that provided fiscal space for government to support reconstruction effort because, mind you, before that, Sierra Leone had gone through a brutal conflict, 10 years of civil war. And so we needed resources to support reconstruction effort and to build the social sector, education, health, and as the case may be. So it is within that context that we had to hook onto an IMF program. In terms of what we did as a country to ensure sustainable debt path right through, firstly was to ensure that we built a capable team, a DSA team, from within, drawn from the Ministry of Finance, Bank of Sierra Leone, Account General's Department, NRA, and all of the relevant players within the macroeconomic environment. We were able to pull several players from such institutions to build this national team. So since 2007, after completion point, we have been conducting annual DSA, okay, on annual basis. So that effort has been providing signals in terms of debt direction and policy feedback to authorities to guide fiscal policy management and, of course, within that context, monetary policy management as well. In addition to that, basically, there has been an active MTDS medium-term debt strategy in place to guide, debt management practices going forward, which is also crucial in that direction. But within the context of an IMF program, as an IDA country, we are not supposed to borrow non-concessionally, and defined by the threshold of 35% grant element. So since that huge stock cancellation in 2007, we had never borrowed commercially, externally. So I mean that was one key consideration that kept our debt very low. In as much as there were several approaches given the huge infrastructure deficits across all sectors. I talk about energy sector, agriculture, education, tourism. There are a lot of gaps in terms of resource needs for government to support and to provide to fill those gaps. But we decided, consistent with the DSA outcome and MTDS, we decided to stay with concessional and grant resources consistent with the IMF program as well. And what is also key is what we did, given the regulatory framework. Before 2011, even though the Constitution and other legal instruments provided for borrowing, but these were not consolidated. Okay, so what government did was to enact the Public Debt Management Act in 2011. It provided two giant conditions. Firstly, it gave the Minister of Finance to become the sole agent to borrow on behalf of government. Before that time, every minister, ambassadors were committing government across all sectors. But what the Act did was to say, no, it is the Minister of Finance that is mandated by government, by parliament, to borrow on behalf. So that alone checked, that radical borrowing exposure across all sectors, and also within the context of the Act, there are provisions that restrain local councils and SOEs from borrowing externally, and if they are to borrow domestically, they have to seek the approval of the Minister of Finance. So that again helps us to cushion the aspect of contingent liability exposure from local councils and state-owned enterprises. And but most importantly was the MTDS, medium-term debt strategy. Okay, we decided to give that a priority because of the impact it has on policy information, what we feel to policymakers, that internally to certain political decisions. We were able to to contribute a lot of effort, as I said, from various players, the Bank of Sierra Leone, on the multi-policy side, University of Sierra Leone, we're also part of the team, even the civil society organization, to get their feedback because they intermediate with the wider public. They're also part of that arrangement as well. So we're able to put in place a robust a medium-term strategy over time to guide debt management practices going forward. And in terms of also, in addition to the Public Debt Management Act, there are a lot of reforms, public financial management reform, right across the board. There was the establishment of the National Revenue Authority, agency responsible for revenue administration, and we enacted series of legislation. The Bank of Sierra Leone Act was also enacted. The Audit Service Sierra Leone, the Local Government Finance Act. So there are a lot of regulations that helped, to strengthen public financial management, after EP completion point, to help us to manage government exposure right across central, local government, and SOEs, as the case may be. But in terms of challenges, in 2014, as all of you will be aware that we are hit with what we refer to as a twin shock, the Ebola and, of course, the collapse in our prices. So this actually led to deterioration in external debt exposure. Yeah. Before 2014, we are comfortably at a moderate risk of debt distress, but because of these shocks, it led to deterioration in liquidity indicators, particularly revenue and debt service to revenue and debt service to export. So that's a challenge. And also, given fiscal slippages in recent past, there has been a huge build-up in domestic debt. Okay, so from at end of 2017, domestic debt was about, even though it's accounted for 28% of the total debt portfolio, compared to external debt of 72%, its share, domestic debt service to domestic budget revenue was 19.7% compared to 9.7% of external debt. So you can see the mismatch in terms of the stock and liquidity indicators. Then also the PPP arrangements, new arrangements for PPPs are coming up. There are risk control liabilities that we have to manage. But interestingly, last month, government had to cancel. There was this debt of $200 million to finance an airport from the Chinese. But because of the impact, not only the stock, the level of exposure, the volume, but also the scope of the project and other ancillary costs that could be triggered if government was this government was to go on with that particular project. So government had to withdraw, had to cancel such a loan, with its own implications, as the case may be. So thank you.
That was perfect timing, Charles. Thank you. And for just a really great overview. Just really interesting. And thank you for the two complementing each other so well. Baba Musa.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would start from where Charles stopped. Obviously, with the presentation of the two speakers before me, it was clear that, it is clear that in many of the developing countries and indeed African countries, we have an improved legal framework for public debt management in the last decade. So most countries have passed sound debt management laws that mandate only the Minister of Finance to borrow on behalf of government. That is a great achievement, I think, in terms of sanitizing the debt situation in Africa. But in addition to the legal framework, having a sound legal framework, the managerial structure has also improved. If you look at the most of the African countries, there is a clear delineation of responsibilities in most of the debt offices. By that I mean there's a separation between those who are involved in borrowing or the front office function with the middle office function. At the same time, those who are doing the recording or conducting the back office's function. So that delineation in the managerial structure has improved, at least in most of the countries. And again, there is also, we've noticed that over the years, improvement in coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. So that coordination between the fiscal and monetary policy assists in getting some of the macro variables right. So, it resulted into reduction in some of the requirement borrowing. And generally, again, there's an improvement in the technical capacity of the staff of the debt management offices. You heard from Sierra Leone and Uganda that they now conduct debt sustainability analysis annually on their own with little or no technical assistance. That has been the case in most of the countries. So we have seen general improvement in all these areas. And again, also we also noticed that the domestic debt market is improving. So these are all positive signs that shows an improvement in the landscape of debt management. But above all, we heard yesterday from the presentation of Antonia and the question that she was asked about how she managed Liberia's debt. And the very basic thing for any sound public borrowing is having political commitment. So if you have political commitment and the right person in the helm of affairs, as Minister of Finance, you will always see prudent debt management. But where you don't have the political commitment and the right person is not there, then of course that poses a very big risk to public debt management. So this is what we see as part of the reason why you have for countries that had maintained a sustainable debt management. But let's one more thing is having sound macroeconomic framework. And in most of those countries, you realize that their macroeconomic framework is basically considered as sound. So these are factors that make those countries to maintain debt at a sustainable level. Now, what are the challenges that evolve in the landscape? Well, as was discussed yesterday, obviously the landscape for financing has changed tremendously after the debt relief. Most African countries now go for non-concessional funding. There are emergence of new creditors, but the emergence of the new creditors had actually posed a big challenge to a lot of countries. The biggest challenge has to do, of course, with the capacity to for negotiation. Many people complain about borrowing from China, but borrowing from China is not really bad if you have the capacity to negotiate well. We have seen the case of Rwanda that was able to manage at least borrow effectively from China, and they manage the resources well. Other countries do complain because first, they are not technically prepared in terms of negotiation, but also I think the political authority also need to build their own capacity in the negotiation process. But also we notice a big challenge between the political authority or decision makers and the technical people. In most cases, you find a disconnect between what the technicians do and propose to the political authorities and what the political authorities actually take to implement the recommendations that the technical officials provided. So in my view, there is need really to now focus the capacity building and engagement in with the political authorities to be able to appreciate the work that the technical officials do in their recommendations. But other challenges also have to do with the capacity of the institutions beyond the central government. In terms of reporting debt numbers, the SOEs really do not have adequate capacity to report. Well, what can technical service providers do? Just one very basic point. I think the coordination among service providers is very key to maintaining sustainable capacity. The debt management facility of the World Bank and the IMF came and actually improved the provision of service providers. I think coordination among all the service providers, that will really help in improving the capacity of debt management going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for just following so seamlessly across and picking up some of the broader issues as well. Shakira.
Sure.
And it'd be quite useful if I gave you the clicker, wouldn't it?
Yes, thank you. Sure. Thank you, Marcus. I'm a research fellow here at ODI, and I'll be speaking mostly about managing in public investment projects, given that it's something that's been talked about a bit throughout this conference. So first of all, just to recognize that despite this recent surge in investment across the region, sub-Saharan African countries have an infrastructure gap without a doubt compared to their peers, the regional peers. They're lagging behind, as shown in this graph, in terms of electricity supply, paved road density, public education infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, and access to water. Given this infrastructure deficit, it is therefore not surprising that several governments see borrowing as a means of addressing it. Government borrowing to finance public investments is an essential part of any country's macroeconomic toolkit. This is true for even advanced countries who have this golden rule of borrowing to invest rather in infrastructure rather than to pay recurrent expenditure like civil servant wages. The underlying logic is that while debt finance productive investments could raise a country's debt ratios in the short run, it could eventually lead, if done well, to higher growth, revenues, and exports, and which will over time would lead to lower debt ratios. However, as mentioned previously, some countries that have funded development and infrastructure through borrowing have failed to generate sufficient additional tax revenues to repay that debt. In many cases, countries have not been effective at capturing the return on their investments through their tax systems. This is especially worrying when you take into account that the composition of debt is changing, becoming less concessional. In fact, there has been a surge in borrowing, in non-concessional borrowing on the continent in post-HIPC countries for infrastructure. This includes Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Zambia, 3 of these countries of which are considered high risk of debt distress. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why are projects not repaying themselves, despite being infrastructure? First of all, investing in infrastructure is challenging. That's because infrastructure projects tend to be lumpy, requiring a large volume of upfront financing, while the returns are only realized several years later. They're one-off, often making it difficult to estimate cost. They create assets that, to get the value from that asset, it needs to be maintained, which means more expenditure over years. Also, they take several years to complete, and this means sometimes governments change, which can have an adverse impact on the project continuing. There's a famous study that looked at the cost and time overruns in the construction sector, as shown in this graph, and it did this for developed and developing countries, and it showed that in all cases, their cost and time overruns were common. The overruns were particularly significant for sub-Saharan Africa. The bottom bar is for Ethiopia, and it found that there was an average time overrun of 130% and a cost overrun of 60%. Just a disclaimer, this is from 2011, so things could have improved significantly since then. Right? More recent studies, however, find that public investment in sub-Saharan Africa countries generally appear to be less effective when it comes to generating growth than compared to their peer countries. Thus, just asking what is debt used for, recurrent versus infrastructure, is not enough. Projects may not repay themselves. So, if pouring funds into roads, railways, ports, and power is to boost the economy rather than trigger a debt crisis, then improving the efficiency of public investment management is critical. The IMF and World Bank have recognized this and have significantly stepped up their work in this area. You just have to pick up any article for reports of any sub-Saharan African country. I'm pretty sure one of the recommendations is to improve the efficiency of public investment management. So the support in this area has focused a lot in improving diagnostic frameworks, which aim to assess the quality of the public investment management system, to identify the processes or institutions that are weak, and to suggest, on the basis of this, potential reforms to reduce that eventually lead to less cost and time overruns. This slide provides an example of the IMF's PIMA, Public Investment Management Assessment Tool, which I believe Carolina may speak about briefly as well. It provides a comprehensive assessment of what the IMF sees as the 15 key institutions for planning, allocating, implementing public investment projects. Just to say briefly, based on this assessment, all the sub-Saharan African countries perform relatively well on paper. In practice, public investment management is less effective. And in particular, they can improve public investment management efficiency according to this assessment by improving the selection of projects and appraisals, improving the credibility of multi-year budgeting, and improving the monitoring of projects during actual implementation. So this is some caution when it comes to moving from these diagnostic tools to reforms. All the diagnostics are useful to telling us which capacities are weak and need of reform. Caution must be exercised when using them to formulate a reform plan. First, there's always a danger that diagnostics automatically turn the identified weaknesses into a blueprint for reform without taking into account the local context, particularly underlying political incentives. Given that a lot of the poor infrastructure outcomes are related to these underlying political incentives, a reform strategy that relies purely on a narrow technical or technocratic leadership is unlikely to be successful. Reforms need to find creative ways to address and work around more fundamental incentive problems that underlie these technical weaknesses. And just to be on a more positive note, there are good examples of this happening on the continent. A good example, secondly, it's important to focus on how systems actually function and not just how they look according to these diagnostics. For example, a country may seem to have an investment appraisal system and screening system in place, but if the criteria is so vague that any project could get through, then that tells you that the system probably isn't functioning as it should. Finally, I would like to say that the PIMA, the IMF diagnostic tool, focuses almost exclusively on budgetary institutions. But in a lot of countries, sometimes the budgetary institutions aren't the main bottleneck to investment efficiency. Sometimes it has to do with the processes for land acquisition. So finally, I just want to say that any diagnostic tool can be used poorly or well. The PIMA, also the DEMPA, which is the assessment tool for debt management. What matters most is that it contributes to analysis that engages all the key stakeholders in discussing and fixing parts of the problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shakira. And finally, Carolina.
Thank you. This one? Okay. Shakira's thank you, and my welcome. Okay, so thank you, and I just want to pick up on what was mentioned yesterday a few times, what is, it's good, we are paying a lot of attention to debt dynamics, but what about what is behind the dynamics, and more what we are not recognizing. And there was a lot of mention of management of debt in public corporations and contingent liabilities and other fiscal risks. So the fund after the global crisis, and especially FAD, started to look more at what went wrong during the global crisis and what can we look beyond the dynamics to understand and prevent future crises as the one that we have happened in 2009. And basically, the IMF and the Fiscal Affairs Department has come up with different analytical and diagnostic tools, and I agree with Shakira, this is just one way of approaching the problem. It should never be seen as the final point. It's only the starting point. You go to the doctor to find out what's going wrong, but you know that in the first meeting you're not going to be healthy. You just need to identify what's your problem. So first in 2014, the Fiscal Transparency Code was published to go beyond understanding of central government. We need to look at general government, we need to look at public corporations, we need to expand the coverage of what we are analyzing and what we are reporting on. In 2016, there was a fiscal risk framework was developed in order to give countries tools so that they can analyze, identify, analyze, mitigate, and manage fiscal risks. We don't have to sit with our arms crossed to let fiscal risks just materialize. We need to proactively manage them is the message behind this. a new tool that was developed in 2016 between the World Bank and the IMF, the PFRAM, the PPP Fiscal Risk Management Assessment Model. It allows countries to assess the risk of PPP contracts, contract by contract. So you take the legal contract and you put it in this framework. This is very, very important because it was mentioned PPPs is a source of getting private sector to help us develop more infrastructure to be able to close the gaps. But it is also true that if you don't negotiate well these contracts, down the road they are going to be so much more expensive, and they are going to get fiscal space from future public investment just because your contract, you did not pay enough attention. And the other thing, and it was mentioned that I come from Colombia, developing country, when you compare the lawyers in the Ministry of Finance who are negotiating with the lawyers of this very big infrastructure company, you do see that there's a lot of learning that has to be done in the national government. So understanding the risk behind contracts is very important. Then we developed the fiscal stress test tool, which is a simulation of when you put countries with shocks. What kind of trend is the debt going to have? What kind of fiscal risks are going to materialize when I start having this fiscal stress test? And finally, our most recent work, which was just presented in the annual meetings in Bali, which is the balance sheet approach to fiscal policy, which is the most comprehensive effort to expand to the whole of the public sector, expand liabilities, not just from debt, but to other liabilities, and to pay attention to the asset side. Because at the end, why are we getting all these liabilities? We have a balance sheet. As a nation, we have a wealth. And the point here is we have also to start looking more to the asset side, because as was mentioned by Shakira, you do public investment and you create assets. You have to maintain them, but also there's a point for the debt. We have done thus far 28 fiscal transparency evaluations. Fiscal transparency evaluations, we go with the Fiscal Transparency Code and we analyze fiscal reporting, fiscal forecasting and budgeting, and fiscal risk analysis and management. Of the 28 fiscal transparency evaluations, they have all revealed that there are challenges in the 3 pillars. So there's a lot to do in terms of improving fiscal reporting, and this was mentioned many, many, many times yesterday. We all recognize. These fiscal transparency evaluations have been done mostly in advanced countries, and they have a lot of still room. So this is work in progress for all of us. Fiscal forecasting and budgeting, how is the budget process linked to the whole system, and what are the issues that we are leaving behind? And finally, the fiscal risk analysis and management. As you can see, we have done fiscal transparency evaluations in Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Senegal, and Uganda. Most of them are the East African countries because there's an agreement in the EAC for all the countries to do the fiscal transparency evaluations. And this is very important because it's telling countries where they need to move on. Where do they need to expand in terms of the production of information. This I'm not going to go, but this is the framework that was developed to manage fiscal risks. And first is you have to identify them. If you don't know what are your fiscal risks, there's no way you are going to manage. And it's amazing how identification is still so non-existent in some countries. And the focus here is, and the focus of the TA we are giving is, this needs to be managed by the Ministry of Finance, but this is in coordination with the whole of many actors that are able to, that have the potential risk of generating fiscal risk, if I may say. So the development of fiscal risk statements, the creations of fiscal risk management units in the Ministries of Finance, and a lot of effort to bring the public corporation sectors under this approach. This graph that you can see there is what the PFRAM model the PFRAM model is an Excel tool, and at the end you get a lot of graphs. This is one example of you put one contract, you put it in the framework, and this is what you get. So we have done more than 40 capacity development activities in Africa, which is very good because countries are saying, I want to understand what I'm going behind. This is, we are training officials and we are providing them with the capacity to really understand better the contracts they are signing.
Can you just bring to conclusion, because then we need to, we can go negative. Thank you.
This is just the PIMA, as Shakira was mentioning. This has been very, very successful. We have done 22 PIMAs in Africa. So this, I mean, yesterday when I was here, Africa is paying attention to how to improve the public investment management, and there's a clear recognition of the linkage between this and that. So this is, I see it as a positive factor. The other thing we have learned is that, and I think we all need to learn that, it takes a lot of time for all these institutions to be in place and to work. So we have to start really early in the process, and we have to be realistic of the expectations, because if we are expecting too much too quickly, we will all get frustrated. And then nobody will really trust the effort that is behind building the institutions, and that's a message that I would like to give to everybody. We do what we can, but countries are doing so much more, and recognizing the effort is also very important, because you have to have motivation in order to be able to build these institutions. Right. So this stop, and I don't talk about the balance sheet.
Thank you, sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed. And I think for all of you, for keeping for the time, there's clearly, all of you could spoke for longer, and hopefully some of that will also come out in the questions and answers that we have. So if you're online, please do be sending in your questions. And can we have a first round of questions? I'll take a group of them, and then we'll put them to the panel. And kind of just on the timing. Fine. Questions, please. And we've got some people with mics, I think, roving mics. If no one's going to ask, I'm going to ask my colleague too. I'm going to ask... No, sorry. I'm going to ask Toby. Toby, please, ask us a question.
Thank you. My name is Tove Strauss, and I manage the Budget Strengthening Initiative in Liberia. And I have a Liberia-specific question. It's become obvious that Liberia is paying a lot of paying on debt that is not yet executed, so to speak. The project is not up and running, because after you sign, you start paying immediately. But then they have, if it's a loan, they have to get approval from the legislator. And I'm just wondering if this is, you were talking about the absorptive capacity of projects, etc. So I was just wondering, is this something that's happening in other countries as well? And is there a way for Liberia to negotiate with the lenders? And I'm also talking about, World Bank and IMF, etc., and ADB and the EU and whoever, where you borrow, maybe not EU, but sorry. When you borrow, and the terms might be the same all around the world, but there might be a specific issue with the Liberia way of getting these loans approved by the legislator.
Thank you very much, Toby. When you do introduce yourself and you want to put a question to a particular member of the panel, sing that as well. So we had some... Oh, okay. Mike's going to go there and then come across. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark Hutton. I also work in Liberia with the Budget Strengthening Initiative, and I want to follow up on a question that was asked yesterday, as the link between the technical debt management and the politicians who are making the decisions on managing the debt. So my question is to the panelists, where do you think, at what level in the hierarchy of the government, the debt management technicians should be sitting to be most effective, and what has worked in your countries as far as influencing the politicians and the decision makers?
Andrew here in front.
Good morning, Andrew Lawson. My question is a little bit on the same theme, and it picks up on the notion of political engagement, which Baba Musa was emphasizing and Antoinette emphasized yesterday. And my question is really, which are the tools that can most effectively support political engagement? And I have a worry behind this, Carolina, which is that with the increasing numbers of diagnostic tools, we may be going deeper and deeper into a technical field and actually losing the politicians. Each of these countries mentioned a medium-term debt strategy, and logically that's important. But if your medium-term debt strategy is not supported by a medium-term fiscal strategy, which is actually applied, then it's actually useless. I mean, within the first year, your fiscal deficit targets are not being met, your borrowing is already too high. So I wonder if the panel have any ideas about specific ways of simplifying the technical analysis and creating fiscal anchors or some sort of simple measurements that politicians can hang on to and understand.
Thank you very much. Yeah, yes? I'll take two more questions, so one there and one there, and then we'll...
Thanks. I'm Sivu from South Africa. I have two questions, if I may. One directed to the gentleman from Uganda. I think, thanks first of all for the presentation. I'm wondering, how do you balance the cost-risk trade-off? You touched on risk indicators such as some refinancing risk measure, and you mentioned, if I heard you correctly, that there's a desire from your side to lengthen the term to maturity, but that would come at a cost, because issuing in the longer end, you incur the cost of borrowing. And perhaps the question is, what matters the most to you? What's your criteria like? Is it to meet the borrowing requirement at whatever cost, or there's a refinancing problem such that you want to lengthen the term to maturity? So how do you balance the two? Because the objectives, they tend to conflict. I think one of the ladies touched on asset and liabilities. I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but to what extent can African countries start moving toward a full-blown ALM approach where you match the assets to liabilities? Of course, it would be more applicable if it were an asset portfolio that we were managing, but because it's a debt portfolio and coming up with relevant assets to match the liability portfolio could be problematic. But it's something that we would like to move toward as South Africa, because we have done something similar to the Ugandan approach, but we're still confronted by a ballooning debt portfolio. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Naku Yatma. I work with Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. We're one of the 3 Japanese mega banks. And my question is for Shakira Mustafa, because you started to mention there were some good examples of countries that are doing debt management, but you did not complete that example. And I'd be interested in hearing some of the countries that you think are doing well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all those questions. Caroline, I was wondering if we could start at your end and we'll work back, partly because one of the questions picked up precisely on where you're about to take us to, which is talking about assets and liabilities, but also because, as you're the only one on the panel who's actually also been a minister of plan, I thought there was a lot of conversation around the politics, and you might want to draw it. And then if we just come back across the panel and to ending up, I think, Shakira, there's obviously a particular question for you, and I think there's some particular questions around experiences in Liberia, in Sierra Leone and in Uganda that might inform the questions around Liberia. Carolina, please.
Yeah. So in terms of the linkage between political will and technical strength, I think they should complement each other. I really think that the stronger the technocrats and the stronger, in this case, the ministries of finance, the bigger possibility they have to have a informed dialogue with politicians and really say this is good or this is bad because A, Y, and Z. This does not, of course, means that then they will be taken, that everything they say will be taken into account. But I do think that the more we know, the stronger we are in any negotiation. So if you are looking at this from the Ministry of Finance point of view, you should be able to understand your debt dynamics, you should be able to understand your budget, you should be able to understand how you are linking your development plans to your budget. I think this discussion and the linkage with the PIMAs and the diagnostics and what we mentioned yesterday about the SDGs. If we are really going to achieve that, we really need politicians and the Ministry of Finance and the sectors to be all in the same place. And for that to happen, you need to be able to have a dialogue. Part of what the PIMA does, it starts with the planning. And the planning is linked to the national development plan, poverty reduction strategies, sectoral plans, you name it as you want. Behind those are the ambitions of the programs that the government have, of the politicians that are behind the ministries. So you do have to think, I do think of those plans as the way in which you are putting the political interest in a paper, so that then you can go and plan for it. Plan for it whether you want to make it a public investment, or plan for it because you want to expand your amount of teachers, or you want to expand your health coverage. All of that, I do believe that there's a linkage. So I think part of what we need to understand when we are going as technical assistance providers, it's move away from just the technical aspect of this and see it in the bigger picture, and support the ministries develop the important linkage between the technical work and the political support. If you know your debt numbers, you can go to a debate in parliament and talk about it and convince why you should expand or put a stop to the debt you are doing. But if you don't have your numbers, then nobody will believe you, starting by citizens. Because this is not only politicians, this is also buying the support of the citizenship, because they understand what you are doing. In terms of the balance sheet question, so I just put back there the balance sheet the analysis we just made. We made it for 31 countries. And in that slide, you can see that 5 of them are in Africa. 1 of them is South Africa. So the way this balance sheet was constructed was from the fiscal transparency evaluations. The countries that have had unpublished fiscal transparency evaluations, we use the information because the first pillar builds a balance sheet, which is a compilation of all the available liabilities and assets that are in the central government, the general government, public corporations, and subnational levels. The message of the fiscal transparency is, if you know your assets, you can manage them. We had calculations that you could have 3% of GDP of well-managed assets. 3% of GDP is equivalent to a tax reform without increasing your taxes, so let's pay attention to the assets. But the other message that was there, one of the countries that was highlighted was the Gambia. We did a balance sheet for the Gambia. We worked with the government. So this is, the message is, even in countries that have low amount of information, you can start building this. And that is the approach we want. You start with very low information, but even there you can start doing this kind of analysis.
Sure. I'll start with a question that was specifically directed to me in terms of good examples. So I'll give 3 country examples. I'm going to start with Rwanda, because that was mentioned a lot yesterday. In terms of what has helped Rwanda in terms of managing their debt is that they've been very good at selecting strategic projects that actually contribute to the growth and export diversification. And that's part of it because they have a very long planned and comprehensive public investment strategy. But we all know Rwanda is a bit unique. So what are some other examples from the continent? Ghana. They had a problem with local projects in terms that a third of those projects were not completed. This is based on a 2017 study. And those projects accounted for 1/5 of all capital spending. And the reason for the projects weren't completed is because political leaders were unable to sustain bargains over project distribution over years. And as I mentioned, when there's a change in political leadership, sometimes what that person approved, you don't continue. So what they did is that they said for any aid-funded grant project, there was one simple rule. Existing projects had to be completed before new funds are dispersed. And as a result, aid finance projects were able to had a significantly higher completion rate as a result. So that's Ghana. My third example is Botswana. We actually have the debt official from Botswana here. So if you have time, find her and talk to her. So basically, there's a rapid growth of.
Is the person here?
Miss Peters, are you here? Maybe recovering from last night. We had a lovely dinner. Yeah. So
we'll ask her to stand up so people can find her.
Yes. So just in Rwanda, rapid growth of government revenue from diamonds, and as a result, the government wanted to use this revenue to ramp up public investment. But they recognized that the construction sector had very limited capacity. So what did they do? They didn't just draw up this wish list of ambitious plans. They had a plan, but they actually regularly consulted the local construction industry to find out what was feasible, and if something wasn't feasible, how can we make it feasible? And that's the kind of, that wasn't the PFM system alone. That was the Ministry of Finance going beyond and working with the actual implementers, and that had a positive effect in implementation. And finally, just in terms of Andrew's questions, in terms of diagnostics, and is it becoming too technical and you needing to be more political? Carolina spoke about it briefly, but I think there's all these tools. There's the PIFA, which is for public financial management. There's PIMA for public investment management. There's DEMPA for debt management. Governments are getting exhausted with all these diagnostic tools that are telling them you have a problem in everything. So really what technicians have to be skilled at is explaining to government, this is why you need to care about this from the start, and linking it to government's priorities. A lot of governments, they do want to complete their projects. That makes them look good as well, right? So you have to recognize that. And you have to link it to government priorities, and also understand how local institutions work. So who do you need to talk to get buy-in? So that's all I'll say, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Barbara, just before I come to you, I just want to put Geoffrey and Godfrey and Charles on notice, because we've got an online question for the two of you. So the question is from David Mahali. I'm not sure I've got the pronunciation right, I'm sorry. The question is, what role did natural resources play in driving debt accumulation? Are there any thoughts on the potential and risk from resource-backed loans, especially from China? So that was the question just to you two. So I thought I should just give you notice before I come to that. Barbara, first.
Thank you very much. I have, I think, two questions relating to my presentation. One has to do with what Liberia is paying when the loan is not yet approved. Generally, I think it's, again, the issue of partly capacity building and knowing exactly what to do before signing a loan agreement. Creditors always argue that you have to pay a commitment fee because for you to borrow from them, they will have to commit the funds of from where they, of course, source it to make sure that you are going to utilize the fund. And so this is where it brought the issue of medium-term debt management strategy come to fore. So before you sign a commitment with a donor or a creditor, at least you should be able to incorporate your fiscal policy with the debt policy. The debt policy. But I think if the Liberian officials are well trained or share information with their colleagues, I think they should be able to get a sound practice in this kind of arrangement. So what we are doing from YFM side is to be organizing a debt management forum where we bring all the debt managers together once a year to share sound practices and information on creditor practices. And we did the phase 2, and we have seen a great improvement in coordination among debt managers and, of course, providing information among creditor practices. That, I think, is helping in the way forward. There's another key question on the political, how to engage the political authorities. Why I brought that discussion was before coming here, I was in one of our countries, assisting them in debt management, debt sustainability analysis. And one of the issues that came was we were applying the new DSF Link tool. And in the realism tool, the projections that were made for revenue in the fiscal area, the realism tool actually flagged query the projections that we did. So we had to bring the members from the revenue generating authorities to query and queried the projections that they did. They came with a very sound fiscal framework, which did fantastic medium-term projections that were much lower than the revenue numbers they gave us. And when we asked them, they said, well, this is what the tool brought, and we have been using it over several years. But we took the results to our minister to approve, and he told us that, this revenue projection is much lower than last year's revenue, what we had in the budget. We cannot go back to the president and tell him that we cannot afford to get put this revenue or recommend this revenue. So do some engineering and find a way of, incorporating this. But we have seen that it was not realistic. So we had to, think of how do we then approach this kind of thing. And what we found is that the best way is to also build the capacity of the legislatures to query this kind of activities, because ultimately, even if you prepare a budget, they have the ultimate responsibility of approving the budget. And if they can ask certain key questions and technical questions that they can query, I think it will put the political authorities in check. But Nigeria did one thing with the support of African Capacity Building Foundation and the African Development Bank in recent time. They have established what they call Institute of Legislative Studies, which we found very, very productive in the region. So what they do is that now when they have legislatures, they train the legislatures in that Institute of Legislative Studies on basic macroeconomic management and essential things to do in budget preparation and process, including debt management strategy. In fact, I have, in 2 days' time, I will be going there to discuss with the legislatures in Nigeria on how to prepare a debt management strategy, or the basic thing to look out for when a debt management strategy is prepared. So we found this to be very, very productive and effective in engaging the political authorities. But that is not enough, because addressing the legislatures is one, but also building the capacity of the ministers is another important thing. And I have seen that MEFMI organize what they call a combined forum for ministers of finance and governors of central banks. And we see that as a good platform also to at least engage the political authorities, especially the ministers of finance, in certain key things. So I think these are ways that will improve the political commitment. But we also have the donors side. The donors need also to contribute in this area. We have heard about the DEMPA, the Debt Management Performance Assessment Tool, which is not supposed to be a conditionality tool. But in many cases, it brings strengths and weaknesses of debt management in countries. And not all countries are committed to, publishing this kind of diagnostic information. So donors should find a way of engaging the countries to at least publish those things, so that technical service providers and the donor community themselves will know the areas of weaknesses in countries. So this can help the donors themselves to also engage with the political authorities in addressing key areas of capacity building needs. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for me, well, I just want to take a cue on the political, the nexus between the technicians and the political class. How to guarantee that? For Sierra Leone, I think, firstly, it comes by what I refer to as luck, okay, to guarantee the commitment from the highest level. It is by luck or by blessings, all right? Because, take for instance what happened quite recently. When the former, because we recently had our elections, there's a new administration in place, okay? But there was this loan that was contracted with the Chinese, okay, for $200 million to finance an airport, a new airport, okay? That has been on the table for the past 4 years, even though the loan was signed in 2015, thereabout. It was not actually ratified by Parliament, because for the past 2 years, we have been flagging that in our DSA, that if we proceed with that, it will lead us to high risk of debt distress. But nevertheless, the past administration had to ratify it. But when this new government came, I mean, based on technical advice, if we are to proceed with it, then of course it will pose serious challenges in terms of their sustainability. So His Excellency the President, they had to withdraw from the deal. So that was commitment at the highest level. It goes beyond the Minister of Finance, because the Minister of Finance is answerable to the President. So you may cajole him, you may do your technical gymnastics and present a nice case to the ministers, but he has to take it to his boss. So that's why I say it's by blessing you to guarantee political from the highest level. For me, that's the key thing. But also what has helped us over the years is we bring into the mix civil society organization. The last DSA we had, Baba was there. There was a civil society representative in the room. So we did the analysis together, and they're involved. So they take the message out there. And also the audit service Leone, okay, they, of course, in terms of auditing the process, fiscal management, they have to put out reports. You have to strengthen the arm of the audit service. So once the report are out there in the public, then of course, you as a government, you want to win the favor of the electorate. So if they advise you to do what is right, I think with the support of the civil society organization, audit service, I think that will guarantee some level of political commitment. But at the end of the day, it's a lock. It's luck and by blessing. Then also, in terms of, well, let me go directly to the question being posed from online. What role did natural resources play in driving debt accumulation? I mean, Sierra Leone is a typical example, even though our economy is small, but we are heavily commodity dependent. In 2011, 2012, when the iron ore boom was triggered, we were at a very comfortable level of moderate risk of debt distress, because there were rosy projections in terms of export was peaking, then the related revenue. So we have this very sound macroeconomic path, projected path. But by 2014, 2015, when the price of commodity dropped, automatically everything was thrown out of the window. But by then, government had signed so many contracts, so many exposure, the road sector, agricultural sector. By end of 2017, the domestic supplies areas was $1.5 billion, almost 30% of GDP. How are we going to finance that with this continuous, this suppressed global iron ore prices? So it's a challenge. So that in itself, I mean, I was talking about diversification, which is key. But then again, how to finance these various sectors to support this and diversification and drive. So that's also a concern. So for me, basically, we have to be critical in terms of how we approach fiscal management going forward. Diversification is the key, and also build capacity across all the relevant sectors, you know, to help us push in that particular direction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. This has been talked about. In terms of link between the technocrats and the politicians, the systems are already in place. We have top technical meetings, we have top management, there is a cabinet, then they go to parliament. But outside that, we also hold meetings. Just last week, we had to organize a meeting with the members of parliament and responsible ministers. It was a retreat for 2-3 days. My friend Emmanuel there attended, so that we talked outside the parliamentary or national assembly where there is tension. We freely had to educate each other on debt causes and also way forward. On terms of tools, I also feel we have adequate tools in Uganda. We have the budget framework paper. This has already now reached cabinet. We are about to do the debt sustainability analysis, and with provisional approvals so far, before it reaches even parliament, or even when it is with the parliament, before parliament approves. On the basis of that, we shall take informed decisions on which way to go in terms of debt sustainability analysis. My colleague from South Africa, I can't agree with you more. These are the challenges when we are looking at portfolio analysis, when you are doing the cost risk analysis. How do we balance the two? We're trying to limit financing by going for long tenor securities, but the long tenor securities also result into big interest costs and so on. Of course, what we do during the MTDS is to come up with different scenarios where some of these challenges, some of our costs are covered, and then we come up with aggregate results scenario by scenario. But to really target this challenge, because it is there, we're trying to get into reforms. Our domestic markets are still shallow, so we're trying to, we've already adopted the single pricing. We're also now trying to do second phase of reforming the primary dealership. We're trying to go the Kenya way of mobilizing investments from retail investors through mobile money, and we're trying to use their model. We're also trying to liberalize or open up or reform the pension fund with a lot of political resistance, but we're trying to get there so that we address the financial viability of the domestic sector, which we feel should be able to bring down the interest costs. On the last one, online, this is true. As we recklessly, if we are to recklessly handle resources, then we shall affect the exports, we shall affect production, we shall affect taxation, we shall affect, we shall not be able to finance. In the case of Uganda, one example is on the lakes. People had gone reckless to fish all the young fish until government took a political decision and deployed their military. So this has saved the lakes. A number of fishery plants had closed. As we talk, more than 10 have reopened. So we need to be careful with resources.
Thank you very much indeed. We have run almost exactly to time. It's 1 minute to go before the coffee. I just wanted to take this chance. It's not often that ODI has two former ministers of finance sitting in the room, one of whom is, of course, going to come to speak to us at lunchtime, and you may want to reflect on the questions that have been asked. But I thought there's some definite questions there around how you manage the politics. But Antoinette, do you just want to give us any last reflection of how you manage dealing with the presidents and this political nexus and not just the technical? Would you just like to give us a closing thought on that one before we go off to coffee? And
I'd just repeat what I said yesterday in the context of the speech and then the discussion, questions that came up around that. Clearly, technicians have quite a challenge at times in really making their very good technical work influence policy making. And I think there's certainly a role for the top in signaling that the work of technicians is valuable. And there's also a role of partners in doing the same to the politicians when they engage with the politicians. There's outreach, as you've heard from others, can be useful. But in the final analysis, it's really whether, your back is protected by the president when you're Minister of Finance that matters. If the president signals that this is a priority, typically, people fall in line. So that, to me, was what helped us to move forward in Liberia, because we were all aligned on one objective in the immediate aftermath of the war, that was to clear our arrears and to get new financing. And everybody had to play ball on that. And I was supported in that regard. But there are times when others, of course, try to influence the president, and you have to be strong enough to push back and tell the president that this is what is at stake. When, as a politician, politicians become politicians sometimes, and look for scapegoats. You have to also realize that ministers of finance are convenient scapegoats. You sometimes have to play that role to get beyond that and to see what you can buy with being a scapegoat sometimes.
Thank you very much indeed for that final. Please, can you join me in thanking our panel and wish them all the very best as they go back to their day jobs.